Israeli soldiers went into a village, rounded up 12 men. There was no accusation of any wrongdoing. They simply rounded them up. The men came peaceably and sat quietly until all 12 were found. Then the 12 Palestinians were taken to a nearby orchard. In groups of 3, they separated. By then, they had had their arms shackled behind them. There was no way that any of them could use their arms. 3 Palestinians were taken to one part of the orchard with a group of Israeli soldiers, and 3 other groups of Palestinians to other points. When they reached their destinations within the orchard, they forced them to lie on the ground. They put shackles now on their legs. Then they took clubs. This was on higher authority. They didn't think this scheme up. It was in the chain of military command. They took clubs and beat on these poor 12 Palestinians until both arms were broken and both legs were broken, with one exception. In each group of 3 Palestinians, the order was given to break just the arms of one person. So, in time, when he could recover his senses from the terrible pain that had been inflicted, he would be able to get himself up on his feet and go to the village and summon help. This dreadful assignment was so terrible, according to the article, that a number of the Israeli soldiers refused to take part. So they stayed in the bus that had brought the group to the orchard. The man operating the bus revved up the engines to make them noisy. Flannel was stuffed in the mouths of each of the 12 Palestinians before the beating began. And the news story in this Hebrew language, respected daily in Jerusalem, stated that most of the clubs were broken in the process of inflicting this dreadful injury to these innocent people. And don't think this was just an isolated incident, says the story, because just 2 days earlier, the same unit, on the same orders, inflicted the same sort of damage in a neighboring village. Let me read from Haaretz's article. Haaretz's article says, "This story is a grim one. In the new Israel, any atrocity is possible." Those are not my words. Those are the words of the reporter that dug up the story. And then the article said, "It should be noted that since the incident, some of the officers involved have been promoted in rank. No one has been brought to trial. As an American, I hang my head in shame that this happened with U.S. aid, with U.S. complicity, because these dreadful policies could never have been carried out without the acquiescence of the U.S. government. But let me ask larger questions. What happens to a government in which such atrocities have become commonplace? Israel will never be the same. The Israel of Ben-Gurion, the Israel of Nahum Goldman, the Israel of those people who dreamed of a Jewish homeland of consideration for all humanity, that Israel is already destroyed. Destroyed is this vision of a Jewish state devoted to respect for all human beings. What happens to the soldiers who sat on the bus while this dreadful punishment was being carried out? What happens to the minds and the attitude and the character of the soldiers that actually went into the orchard to carry out the beatings? What happens to the officers on high who designed this form of torture intended to keep the Palestinian people in line in their place. And what happens to the Palestinians? Those who were tortured will never forget that experience, nor will their relatives, nor will their neighbors. As long as they live, this dreadful experience will burn in their existence. But beyond the torture is another ominous face to the new Israel. Israel Shahak spoke of it with great eloquence and feeling during that luncheon meeting to which I referred. Israel Shahak's clarion call today and his warning is against something that is entirely new, something that Adolf Hitler had no way to inflict upon the Jews in Europe. It's slavery with a high-tech twist. Palestinians are now computerized. Each has an ID card that in the hands of Israeli authorities will call up all vital information about him, any charges that might have been made, whether founded or otherwise. The big brother of George Orwell's 1984 has found ultimate expression in Israel 1989. In Israel Shahak's words, Israeli authorities can now call up total information about each Palestinian, no matter where they are. And only Jews, of course, can operate the computers. Israel Shahak calls it computerized slavery, the wonders of 20th century. Excuse me. The wonders of 20th century civilization, computerized slavery. Isn't it marvelous? To Israel Shahak, computerized slavery is a dreadful evil, an evil so dreadful that, listen to my words, an evil so dreadful that it justifies civil war. Yes, civil war. Am I expressing inflammatory language here tonight in Cape Town, South Africa? These are not my words. These are the words of Israel Shahak, an Israeli Jew, a survivor of the Holocaust, who describes himself as a law-abiding Israeli citizen. He says Israel's computerized slavery warrants civil war. And he warns also that the next victims of computerized slavery may be the Jews themselves. Evil begets evil. Slavery begets slavery. And he adds this stunning, this shocking note. He reports that a majority of Israeli citizens, 58% of them to be exact, according to a recent public opinion poll, believe that internal disruptive forces within Israel are now so powerful that civil war in Israel is inevitable. 58% of Israeli citizens believe that to be true. And how does Israeli Shahak, that great law-abiding Israeli citizen who grieves for his country, how does he feel about civil war? Here are his words given that day at the luncheon event. I prefer civil war to computerized slavery. What has led Israel Shahak and his countrymen to this forecast of civil war? For part of the answer, let me turn to another scene and another person. At breakfast one January morning, this past January in Cairo, I met by chance a Palestinian Quaker who helps young Palestinians in Gaza who are afflicted with an all-too common problem, stress. Get a picture of her. She's short, she's dark-skinned,